And we kind of looked at each other and kind of knew we were being a little bit kind of edgy when we sort of said, I'd love to turn you on. So we kind of knew like this would have an effect.
A Day in the Life has got to be one of the most loved songs of the Beatles, and it serves as the closer to one of the most loved albums of all time, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But the story behind the song's creation is incredibly interesting for three main reasons. One, the tragic true story that inspired the song, or at least the first two verses. Two, the way John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote the song. And three, the groundbreaking way the Beatles recorded the orchestra for the song. So let's start with the first one, the tragic true story that inspired this song. And by the way, if you love delving into music history like I do, click subscribe and join our pack. The song's opening verse is arguably one of the most recognisable in music history. Written by John Lennon, it refers to the death of someone the Beatles knew, Tara Browne. He was somewhat close to both Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Tara Browne was the 21-year-old heir to the Guinness fortune. He was killed instantly when he crashed his Lotus sports car into a parked van at 120 miles per hour on a street in Chelsea, in London. This was on the 18th of December 1966. Now, John Lennon would frequently use newspapers as inspiration for his lyrics, and on this particular day, he had his newspaper propped up against his piano, and when he saw this particular news story, well, it produced one of the most recognisable opening lines in music history. I read the news today, oh boy. Tara Browne was good looking. He had blonde hair, he had family money. He was a well-known figure in the party scene of London, hanging out with famous people like Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, and of course, the Beatles. This party lifestyle, however, eventually took a toll on his relationship with his wife, Nikki. She eventually moved to Spain, while Tara, about to inherit £1 million, moved into the Ritz Hotel on Piccadilly. Meanwhile, Tara's mother, Una, took their two young sons back to Ireland, and this sparked quite a fierce custody battle that the Guinness family eventually won. Tara was now focused on becoming a racing driver. Spoiler alert, it didn't quite work out, and he invested his inheritance in a garage and purchased a hand-painted Lotus sports car. Just before Christmas in 1966, Tara was planning to visit his brother, Garrick, at Lugala in Ireland for the weekend. But he changed his mind and stayed in London instead to spend the day with his friend, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. That evening, he took 19-year-old model Suki Poitier, who had appeared as one of the Bond girls in Casino Royale, out to dinner. He then drove her home in his new pale blue Lotus Elan. Except, of course, he never quite made it to his destination. Suki survived the crash, though she would later die in another car accident 13 years later. Tara didn't survive. He died instantly. Tara's body was eventually brought back to Ireland. Waking up and seeing the news that morning, Lennon was inspired to write a new Beatles song. But the way in which this song was written was rather unique for the Beatles. By the time the Beatles started working on their famous 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the way John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote songs had changed a lot. In the early days, they would write together, face to face in the same room, but during this time, it was much more common for them to write alone and then bring what they had written to the other person to edit, critique, and what have you.
He kind of had the first verse, and this often happened. One of us would have a little bit of an idea, and instead of sitting down and sweating it, we just bring it to the other one and kind of finish it together, because you could ping pong.
In the case of A Day in the Life, the collaboration came from combining parts of songs that John Lennon and Paul McCartney had written separately. As Lennon explained in a 1980 interview with Playboy, I was reading the paper one day and noticed two stories. One was about the Guinness heir who killed himself in a car. On the next page was a story about 4,000 potholes in the streets of Blackburn, Lancashire that needed to be filled. Now, McCartney was responsible for the middle section of the song, the woke up, fell out of bed part, which shifts Lennon's dreamy acoustic style into a more upbeat rhythm. Now, Lennon later clarified in a Rolling Stone interview that while the song was indeed inspired by Tara Browne, that story was used in the context of a broader narrative for this song. Tara didn't blow his mind out, Lennon said, but it was in my mind when I was writing that verse. The details of the accident in the song, like not noticing traffic lights and a crowd gathering at the scene, were also part of the fiction. So Lennon used the news of Tara Browne as inspiration for these lyrics. In the third verse, Lennon talks of a new film, referring to his recent acting role in Richard Lester's How I Won the War. Lennon had just finished filming this film a few months back. I saw a film today, oh boy, the English army had just won the war, as the lyrics go. At the end of the third verse is the famous line, I'd love to turn you on. Now this line was supposedly what led to the BBC banning the song from the radio. Many believe it's a sexual reference, but in fact, it's a drugs reference. The BBC believed that A Day in the Life and some other tracks from the Sgt. Pepper album were advocating drug use. After the third verse, there's the surreal orchestral crescendo moment, which bridges Lennon and McCartney's verses. The way this orchestra was recorded was groundbreaking at the time. We'll get onto that in a bit though. Now, McCartney's part of the song is simpler and more upbeat compared to Lennon's, talking about someone waking up late and almost missing the bus. After McCartney's verse, the song returns to Lennon's style of storytelling, where he draws inspiration from stories that he's read in the newspaper. In the same newspaper as Tara Browne's story is the story about there being potholes in the north of England. There are 4,000 holes in the roads in Blackburn, Lancashire, or 1/26th of a hole per person, according to a council survey. That was a line from the newspaper article which Lennon used as another detail in the song. And though the holes were rather small, they had to count them all. Now they know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. Now it might seem odd to write a song by reading news stories and turning them into rhymes, but really, this is Lennon commenting on the kind of pointless, everyday details that often fill most conversations in life. Now, when it comes to the recording of the song, the main thing that stands out is the orchestra, and the way they recorded this orchestra was quite groundbreaking. The orchestral parts of A Day in the Life reflect Lennon and McCartney's interest in avant-garde music at the time.
And I came up with this idea. I said to the orchestra, all you got to do is everyone start on the lowest note that your instrument could play and work your way up to the highest at your own pace. That was too puzzling for them. So George Martin, the producer, realized that. He kept the random aspect, but he said to the people, you should be about this note at this point in the song, and then you should have got to this note and this note. And he left the random thing. So that's why it sounds like a chaotic sort of swirl, you know.
To fill the 24-bar middle section, they asked George Martin to produce something that felt like the end of the world. Martin wrote a loose score to guide the orchestra, allowing for improvisation within a defined structure. The orchestral part was recorded in February 1967, with Martin and McCartney conducting a 40-piece orchestra. The session, costing £367, close to £9,000 in today's money, was filmed for a planned TV special that never happened. Now, McCartney actually wanted a 90-piece orchestra, but this was a bit too much to handle, so instead, they recorded the orchestra multiple times and combined the tracks into one. George Martin deserves a lot of praise for the production of this song. He took McCartney's avant-garde orchestral ideas for the connecting sections and blended them seamlessly into a polished, accessible recording. A combination of the way they recorded the orchestra, combining multiple takes into one track, and also the fact that it's so avant-garde anyway, made it quite a groundbreaking recording for the Beatles. There are also a ton of theories as to what the swirling orchestral crescendo and the chilling final piano note represents. Does it symbolize the noise in trying to figure out the meaning of life? Does it represent a sense of transcendence, breaking through the monotony of daily life? Before you get too deep into that, I like to think of this quote from Paul McCartney. He's talking about a conversation he once had with George Martin. George asked me, "Do you know what caused Sgt. Pepper?" I said, "In one word, George, drugs. Pot." And George said, No, but you weren't on it all the time." Yes, we were. Sgt. Pepper was a drug album. And that's all you need to know, really, isn't it? Now, there's another heartbreaking, tragic story behind another iconic song from the 60s. It's Gimme Shelter by the Rolling Stones. I've made an entire video on that as well. Click over there to watch it next.